Hey everybody, thanks for joining me today to talk about the challenges of Twitter-based education. My name is Tejas Desai, and in the next 30 to 40 minutes, I'm going to walk you through how nephrology has been using Twitter and what some of the challenges are after a decade's worth of use in the nephrology community. Uh, Definitely ask your questions in the chat box on the right-hand side, and you can always send me a DM at NephOnDemand, which is my Twitter handle, if you have any questions later on. So these are my disclosures. I'm a social media analyst, and I analyze tweets, not just in nephrology, but in other medical specialties as well. So the more you use Twitter, the better my research is, which is what I then turn around and try to use to help different societies and different specialties. I have a software company called NOD Analytics. I founded it in 2010, right after I graduated from fellowship, and a lot of the data comes from there. And finally, I created something called the nephtwitterarchive.com, which some of you may already know about, but we'll talk about that in detail at the end of the presentation because it's one of the solutions to the challenges that we're facing. So let's go right to the Twitter revolution, right? Lots of medical and surgical specialties are using Twitter for education. And to be frank with you, some of them are more advanced than others. I'm going to take the position that nephrology is the most advanced. And I think I have some data to support that. We definitely have the street cred to say that we're the most advanced. This is a list of so many different things that a variety of people and individuals are doing on Neph Twitter. And we've been doing these things for quite a long time. So nephrology on Twitter has a real large breadth and deep depth of offerings in the Twitter learning community, which is why I think that we're probably the most advanced. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with not being as advanced as I would say. But if you're a medical specialty that's not nephrology and you're using Twitter-based education, then you're probably in your honeymoon period. And so I define the honeymoon period as a period when you can't see all the components of the light. You only see one color, and what you see is everything that's good and everything that's exciting. You're not able to really see the challenges that you're going to face in a few years. That's where nephrology is different. Because we're so far ahead, because we've been doing Twitter-based education for such a long time, because we've leveraged Twitter so well, we can now see the different components of our activities. We can see the good and the exciting, but we can also see the challenges. So that puts us in a really important position. Not only are we unique in the sense that we're leaders, but we're also going to set a trend for what other societies and other specialties are going to do when they realize that they have the same challenges that we're facing. So what are those challenges? So Neph Twitter, in general, that's Twitter, the nephrology component of Twitter, has three challenges that I've identified: gender inequality, polarization, and the downside of customized search. We have one option in solving these problems, and it's just ignoring them. Just become blind to all of these problems, and the problems will go away. Except that never happens. Problems never go away when you ignore them. And what will happen to our Twitter community is it will become more polluted, more toxic, weaker in its ability to educate us, and much less valuable than it could be. So I don't think ignoring these challenges is the right strategy. So the other strategy is to just walk away from Twitter. Because you and I both know that none of us really needed Twitter in order to learn. Almost all of us who are watching this presentation and having this conversation learned nephrology and medicine in the absence of Twitter. So why not just walk away and all these problems will automatically go away? So I think that's also a suboptimal idea because you would be walking away from a tidal wave of people who are entering into nephrology Twitter. Here's the number of people who are participating in a nephrology conference on Twitter from 2011 up to 2020. This is the pandemic year, so I think it's understandable why the number dropped. But if you exclude 2020, you start at 114, you go up to 11,386. That's a huge jump. That's what's happening in the nephrology Twitter community. So if you walk away, you're going to be probably the only one because everyone else is walking into Neph Twitter. Here is a number of the conferences that are broadcast on Twitter from 2011, when there was only one, it was the ASN's conference, up to 2019, where there was 200. Again, ignore the 77 because that's in the pandemic year. So remember that each of these conferences has a society that is sponsoring it. And so what this graph really represents is the number of societies that are making some sort of investment into Twitter-based education. And that number is increasing. So what I want to share with you is that going against the tidal wave may not be the best idea. Walking away from Neft Twitter is going to result in you losing your presence, you losing your voice, but nothing really deleterious happening to the community. And we would rather have you in the community with a presence, with a voice, because as you'll see in this presentation, we need everybody's suggestions in how to solve the challenges that we're facing. So please don't walk away, but rather engage with us. All right, so let's take a look at the agenda here. I want to talk about 3 challenges in Neft Twitter: gender inequality, polarization, and customized search. And in the end, I want you and I to come up with some solutions so that we can get to parity, unification, and standardized search. I have organized this presentation such that I'll walk through the 3 challenges and show you the data. And at the end of the presentation, I'll talk about some of the solutions that I think may work. But remember, I want to hear what you have to say. So while we go through this presentation, please jot down some notes about what you think could be potential solutions to these challenges. Share them with me in the chat box if you have that opportunity. Otherwise, save them until the end of the presentation. But we definitely want to know what you have to think about strategies to solve these challenges. So let's go to gender inequality first. It's unfortunate, but gender inequality is in every aspect of science and medicine. And this is just a short list of the things that I have read about in previous years, but it's pretty much everywhere. And I didn't even bother to give you a citation because, frankly speaking, this is now a fact of life. Everybody should know this. And everybody should also recognize that if we have a Twitter community that has gender parity, everything will work out better for the people who are in it, for the idea of sharing information with each other. Everything will improve. Unfortunately, we're not here. In Twitter, we're here. There's a gender disparity. And I was hopeful at first that when we built our Twitter community, that we would have recognized that we should not import those aspects of the real world that we are not happy with, that we know hurt science and education and are not merit-based. Unfortunately, gender inequality has gotten into our Twitter communities, and so we have to make an active effort now to extract inequality from our Twitter communities. So how are we going to do that? First, we need to define what gender inequality is. A lot of us just focus on representation. Hey, if you have the same percent of females and males at the table, you're a winner. You've reached gender equality, game over, let's move on to the next problem. I disagree, and I'm not the only one who disagrees with that. Gender inequality is broken down into 3 components: representation, which is your seat at the table; inclusion, which is then having a voice at the table in which you're sitting in; and then belonging, which is having a voice at that table and having people who are receptive to hear what you have to say. So we're going to talk about these 3 components of gender parity. First, we'll look at real world data, what's happening in the ASN. And I chose the ASN because, number 1, it's the largest nephrology community on the planet. Number 2, they've been working on gender inequality for years. And number 3, we have good data from them in the real world, and we have good data in the Twitter world for the ASN. So let's take a look at their real world data first so we can get an idea of what we're starting with. So this is data from the ASN itself. On the left are the raw numbers of females and males who make up the membership from 2015 to 2020. And on the right are the percentages. And so I want you to focus on the percentages. From 2015 to 2020, the percent of females in the membership goes from 27% to 32%. In other words, about 5% over 6 years. Now, some of you may say, that's great. At least it's going up. We're making progress year after year. And others may say 5% over 6 years is pretty anemic. It's tepid growth. It's not something to be impressed over. I want you to hold your thoughts about that because I want you to remember this data when we compare it to what's happening in the Twitter learning community. Let's round this out with inclusion and belonging. This is the best inclusion and belonging data we have from any nephrology society on the planet. This is the percent of females that are speakers at the ASN meetings from 2011 to 2019. The same for female moderators, and then the same for early program chairs. The lines are positive, positive slope, which is a good thing. Some are more positive than others. This is barely positive compared to the other two, but at least it's going up in the right direction. So more female scientists have a voice at the table, inclusion, and more of their voices are being heard, belonging. All right, what's happening online? So now let's look at KidneyWk data. That's the online equivalent of the ASN. On the left, the raw numbers of females scientists versus male scientists from 2015 to 2020. On the right, the percentages. I'm going to ask you to ignore what's happening in 2020 down here. This is the year of the pandemic, and there's a lot of funny stuff happening here. So this is for another presentation at another time. Let's just look at data from 2019 to 2015. Over 5 years, female representation goes from 25% to 30%. In other words, 5% in 5 years. It's a growth rate of 1% per year, which is pretty identical to what you see with the ASN membership data. So that brings up an interesting point. It is difficult to attract individuals to become a member of your society because there are many barriers in becoming a member of any professional society. The most common and well thought out barrier is that there are financial constraints, but there are also language constraints, geographic constraints. These constraints, these barriers, which are present in the real world, can disproportionately affect one group of people more than the other. And so in the end, you may not reach gender parity, gender equality as fast as you want in the real world because of these barriers. That's not an excuse, that's just to say that's what's happening. In Twitter, however, these barriers don't exist. There aren't geographic barriers, there aren't financial barriers, and now with the ability to translate your tweets into any language you want, there aren't language barriers. So we should expect a growth rate in female representation to surpass that which we see in the real world. And unfortunately, that's not happening. 1% per year in Twitter, which is the same as 1% per year in the real world. So I would suggest and I would contend that the data you see here is really an underperformance. This really is anemic, tepid growth, and it's something that we have to address. Now let's look at inclusion. You'll note right away that I didn't stop at 2015. This time I went all the way back to 2011, and there's a reason why. So first, let me tell you how we measured inclusion. We just looked at the number of tweets that are being authored per scientist, and then categorized the scientist as a female or a male scientist. In 2011, the female scientists as a group had a stronger voice than the male scientists. 6.2 tweets per female scientist versus 4.3 per male scientist. After that, there is a huge drop in the female scientist's voice, such that when you get to 2015 and 2016, the female scientist's voice is half of that as the male scientist's voice. It's not until 2018 where you start seeing some equality again in voice, and then back in 2020, last year, where the voice of the female scientist is now greater than the voice of the male scientist. So this data suggests that we're going in the right direction ever since 2018, and it's okay to overshoot when you're trying to reach equality. That happens. But what concerns me is the last time female scientists had a greater voice than male scientists was in 2011. And after that, there was a period of 6 years where the female scientist's voice was significantly suppressed and decreased than the male scientist. So this is a trend, a pattern we don't want to repeat again. And finally, belonging. So belonging is probably the toughest component of gender inequality because it's difficult to measure. I'll give you the icons of a variety of social media platforms and social media companies like mine because we all measure belonging differently. Some people measure replies, retweets, likes, favorites. We don't measure any of those things. What we measure is intent. So here's our hypothesis, our supposition. If a scientist intends to communicate with someone, that scientist will tag that person in his or her tweet. That's a voluntary action that the first scientist is making to indicate, to acknowledge to the second scientist, I want to hear what you have to say. And so that intent is what we measure, and that's how we determine whether somebody's voice is being heard. So let's take a look at that data. So this table here represents voluntary communications, the intent between the first scientist, a female, and the person that the scientist wants to hear from, another female. And the graph here just breaks this data down by year. So this is a composite of 6 years of data from 2015 to 2020. And this is the breakdown by year. So let's take a look at the mahogany shaded area first, because that represents this number here, female, female. In other words, a female scientist who wants to hear from another female scientist. In total, it's 9% of all these voluntary interactions, only 9%. And if you look at the graph, that is actually increasing until you get to 2018. And after 2018, it starts trending down. So we've got a low number here, and we've got a trend that's going in the wrong direction when it comes to belonging of the female scientist's voice. Now take a look at the dark blue. That represents male-female interactions. In other words, a male scientist who is voluntarily making a decision that he wants to communicate with a female scientist. He wants to hear what a female scientist has to say. In total, over 6 years, it's only 10%. And that line, year over year, was growing until 2019, where it dropped. So we've got some concerns here when it comes to the voice being heard of female scientists. Number one, the trend is going down. And so that's concerning. And number two, look at these numbers here. This is between a female scientist making a choice of whether she wants to communicate with another female scientist or another male scientist. 9 versus 20%. So a female scientist is twice as likely to choose a male scientist with whom to communicate than a female scientist. And look at the numbers down here. If that same choice is given to a male scientist, he will choose another male scientist 3 times more often than he will choose a female scientist. So we've got a trend that's going down and these numbers that are really far apart from each other. That's concerning. So here's our challenge. When we talk about representation, we're glad and we're happy, all of us are, that it's gone from 25% to 30% in the last 5 years on social media, but there are not as many barriers on social media as there are in the real world. So this rate of growth should actually be greater than what we see in the real world. And it's not, it's identical pretty much. Having a voice at the table or inclusion, yeah, things look really good right now in 2020. They've been looking pretty good since 2018. But the last time we had a situation where the female voice was stronger than the male voice, which was in 2011, it was followed by 6 years of the female voice being suppressed. Nobody wants that pattern to repeat itself. And finally, voice being heard or belonging. It really never surpasses 10% in the last 6 years. And currently, it's trending down, whether you're a female scientist who wants to hear from a female scientist or a male scientist who wants to hear from a female scientist. So our challenge is to increase representation. The growth rate has to be more than the anemic growth rate that we have right now. Maintain inclusion, because we're in a good place right now. The last time we were in a good place, we had a 6-year setback. We don't want that pattern to happen again. And we need to accelerate belonging. We need to go above 10%, and we need to change the direction back towards the positive again. All right, so this is a good break point right now for us to just stop and for me to ask you to jot down your thoughts about what solutions you might have or want to see implemented when it comes to gender inequality on social media. Remember, use the chat box if you have any suggestions, or jot it down and communicate with me later on offline. We're going to go to polarization now, which is the next, and then customize search at the end. You might be wondering at this point how I rank these, because they're definitely not alphabetized. So what I did was I organized them based on what is primarily fueling the challenge. In this case, gender inequality, the thing that's primarily fueling the challenge are human behaviors, human actions, specifically male actions. So this is a man-made, person-made fueled challenge. And down here, the primary thing that's fueling this challenge, that's allowing it to thrive and hindering our network, is the algorithm. And so when we get to polarization next, you'll see a combination of human factors and algorithmic factors that are promoting this challenge. So let's go on to the next slide. All right, so polarization. Here's my operational definition of polarization. It's crowds that form into distinct groups that don't communicate with one another. Now, let's be honest, every community, whether it's online or in the real world, is going to have some degree of polarization. When it's in the real world, there are reasons for polarization to occur. We have geographic barriers, we have time zone barriers, language barriers, and financial constraints. So all of these things promote polarization. All of these things are neutralized by Twitter. We don't have these barriers when we're on a social media platform. And yet we have polarization, which I will show you in this section of the presentation. So why do we have polarization if these barriers are all neutralized? It's because of algorithms. That's what we have, that's what we have to identify, and that's what we have to neutralize. So I want to show you the different types of Twitter network morphologies that can exist. This is data from the Pew Research Center. And each one of these morphologies has its own degree of polarization. Because remember, every network, every community, whether it's online or in the real world, will be polarized to some degree. Nothing will be 100% unified. The best type of social media network you can have is here, what we call unified or tight crowd. And even here, you can surmise that there's going to be some degree of polarization because not everybody can be connected with everyone else. What you don't want is a divided or polarized crowd, all right? This is where people are just not communicating with each other. And you can just imagine how that could be bad for science and for the nephrology community, for any community actually, if individuals are not communicating with each other. So what happens when individuals don't communicate with each other when you're in a polarized group? You have limited sharing of science. That's bad. In fact, the whole reason of going onto a social media platform is so that more science is shared, not less. But then you get the majority illusion, which is really described nicely in this PLOS One article. I'm going to summarize it here. The concept of majority illusion is that you think that whatever you're exposed to is what other people are exposed to. And so you automatically assume that the foundation upon which you are basing your knowledge and everything that's growing from it is the same foundation that everybody else has. That's the illusion. You think that you're sharing the same foundation. The reality is you're not. Just because you're exposed to something, some information, some concept, some hypothesis, doesn't mean that everybody else is, because you're in a polarized network. And so if you have this assumption that what you are exposed to is what everybody's exposed to, your discourse is going to be influenced by that assumption, by that illusion. And that discourse is not going to be as fruitful as it could be because the other person doesn't share the same foundation that you have. So things get distorted, and distortion starts to rise, and that leads to a weaker community. So polarization is bad across the board. So what can we do? First, we have to identify polarization, and we can do that two ways. We can measure polarization, we can visualize polarization. We are going to do both in this section of the presentation. So how are we going to do that? First, we're going to look at the metadata of the tweets, specifically of KidneyWk, but we're going to do some comparisons with ERA and NKF. And we're going to look at two metrics, the clustering coefficient and the average path length. The clustering coefficient is a number that goes between 0 and 1. It indicates how well connected the network is or not. If it is very well connected, in other words, if it's unified, the number is close to 1. If it is polarized, the number is close to 0. The average path length measures something different. It measures the number of people that need to take your message and spread it so that your message reaches a random person. For example, if you're watching this and you're my buddy, you're my pal, you're my friend, then there are no individuals between you and I on the social media network. If I want you to get my message, you will get it directly. The average path length is 0. If, however, you're not a friend of mine, we're not acquaintances, then the only way my message can reach you is if there's a group of people in between that can take my message, share it, share it, share it until it gets to you. And we measure that. That's called the average path length. So the more people that I need to rely upon to get my message to you, the more polarized my network. And the less people I need to rely upon, the less polarized, the more unified my network. And lastly, the eigenvector score. So the eigenvector score is not used to measure polarization. It is just used to measure influence. And so I'll show you that on the next slide. I just put it in this slide for completeness. Here we go. Here's the entire social media network for KidneyWk in 2019, the same in 2020. The circles represent people. So I'm in this map, so are you, hopefully. The size is proportional to the eigenvector score, and the eigenvector score measures influence. So in other words, a bigger circle represents an individual with greater influence within this network. Third, the distance from the center is the tendency for polarization. In other words, the farther you are from the center, the more likely you're going to be polarized. And you can already see a polarized group right here for 2020, and you can see a polarized group right here for 2019. There's another one right here, and here's another one right here. Take a look at this group right here. This one is becoming more polarized. So it's still unified when compared to this group, but it's going out to the periphery. That's not good. And then the lines represent transfer of information. This is the sharing of science, right? That's what the lines represent. It's sharing of science from one person to another. All right, so let's look at the raw numbers of each of these network maps. 0.081 for 2019, 0.09 for 2020. In other words, really low clustering coefficients, way more polarized than unified. Average path length, 4.2 people versus 4.3 people. I think it's better to look at these numbers as a trend than to just look at these numbers in isolation. So let's go to this slide here. So this represents the clustering coefficient and the average path length, KidneyWk 2016 all the way to 2020. The clustering coefficient is in blue and is in this axis. The average path length is orange and is in this axis. A clustering coefficient that is trending towards the bottom here indicates that the network is more polarized. And since 2017, that's what's been happening to the KidneyWk network. An average path length that is closer to this end of the scale indicates increased polarization. And the same is true. Since 2017, the number has been rising. So we've got KidneyWk communities that are becoming more polarized ever since 2016. All right, so let's visualize the polarization instead of measuring the polarization. I acknowledge that the metrics I showed you are probably not something you're familiar with. You probably don't see it in nephrology journals a lot. So let me visualize this for you. To do that, I needed to pick the hottest topics in nephrology. So this is a list made by me, and I'm sure you can debate this, but this is what I think are the hottest topics. Anything related to SGLT2s, anything related to mineralocorticoid receptor antagonists, especially the new ones like finerenone, for example, or risaxrenone, and then anything related to HIF-PHI. And instead of just looking at these alone, I decided to map them to broader categories. So instead of looking at the metadata, we'll look at the actual content of the tweets. That's what you see on your device, whereas the metadata is what I see on my device. And we're going to extrapolate SGLT2s to anything that's related to diabetic kidney disease. So I took 13 terms and or phrases and mapped it to DKD. I did the same thing with hypertension, 14 terms and phrases, and the same thing with anemia, 11 terms and phrases. All right, so let's see how polarization manifests. Here's diabetic kidney disease for the network KidneyWk 2019. On the left is the map that you're familiar with. This is the entire network of 2019. And on the right is a same map, but I took away all of the lines of scientific information, so all of the transfer of information that has nothing to do with DKD. The only thing you see now are lines of communication, transfer of scientific information pertaining to DKD. And you can see polarized groups right away. Take, for example, this polarized group. It's a pretty well polarized group. Hardly anybody gets any information about SGLT2 inhibitors in this group. Now let's move on to 2020, for example. Now we see something the opposite. Here's a polarized group, but this time everyone in the polarized group is getting this information, and very little of that information is seeping out to the mainstream community. So, what these two examples show us is that there are large groups of people that are not getting information about diabetic kidney disease. So, what kind of conversation can people have with each other if they're not able to communicate on the same foundation? If someone's getting information and someone else isn't, they're not going to have a productive scientific discussion. The same is true for hypertension. So few people in 2019 were getting information about hypertension that if they were to communicate with someone else, that discussion is not going to be fruitful, especially if that someone else did get the information. That's where the majority illusion comes in, right? Take a look at these people here who are getting hardly anything, if anything at all, it looks like zero information about hypertension. What's their majority illusion? Their majority illusion is most likely that nobody's talking about anything related to hypertension because it's not a hot topic, nothing has changed, there's nothing new to discuss. Similarly here, look at this large group right here. They're getting no information whatsoever about it. There's some information that's being shared here, but that's it. I pointed out this group here, a few slides ago. This is a group that's becoming more polarized. It's not as well polarized as this group here. This group is becoming more polarized. No information about hypertension here. So what's their majority illusion? That nothing's being discussed. There's nothing new. The same story for anemia. 2019 and 2020, it's pretty much the same story. So at this point, you might be saying to yourself, well, I know why the group is polarized. I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? It's just there's a lot of people. When you have a lot of people in your network, you're going to have an increase in polarization. So here's data from the ASN. This data represents the number of people who are participating in KidneyWk. And so yes, the number is rising. Just exclude the pandemic. Here's ERA data. The number is rising, including during the pandemic, which is interesting. And here's NKF, pretty much rising, right? So the hypothesis would be that size is directly related to polarization. So let's see if that's true. So this time, I decided to do a Pearson correlation coefficient across all three societies from 2016 to 2020. Okay? Let's look at the Pearson correlation in blue, which is for clustering coefficient. Remember, if the clustering coefficient is high, close to 1, your network is unified. If it's close to 0, your network is polarized. And we're correlating the clustering coefficient with the number of people that are participating in these conferences. Okay, so what do we see? So in KidneyWk, we see a number that is closer to 0 than it is to 0.5, suggesting to me that maybe size is really not influencing polarity or unity. Maybe there's no correlation there. Then we go to the NKF, and now the correlation is 0.53. So it's above 0.5, it's closer to 1, which would suggest that in the NKF community, or the Twitter community, the more people you have, the more likely you're going to be unified than polarized. Now go to the ERA. The story is really different here. Since 2016, the ERA has figured out that the more people you put into their conference, the more unified the conference will be. This number is really close to 1. That's really interesting. Now let's go to the average path length. So remember, the average path length, the number of people that come in between you and some random person. The larger your average path length, the more polarized. The smaller your average path length, the more unified. So here's a Pearson correlation that's 0.7, closer to 1, suggesting the more people that you put into the KidneyWk community, the higher the path length, the more polarized that network is. Now look at the NKF. That Pearson correlation is 0.4. It's less than 0.5. It's closer to 0, suggesting the more people you put into the National Kidney Foundation Twitter community, the less polarized you are, the more unified you are, because your average path length is lower. Now look at the ERA. It's a negative. It's on the negative spectrum. In other words, the more people you put into the ERA communities, the lower your average path length. So as participant number rises, path length lowers. That means that the more people you put in, the more unified your network is when you're dealing with the ERA. So here's our challenge. It's not participant number alone, aka size of the network, that's driving polarity. We see that in the metrics and we see that with the correlations between size and the clustering coefficient or the average path length. So what general strategies can societies use to negate polarity and strengthen unity? And specifically, what is the ERA and the NKF doing? Because their metrics suggest that the more people you put into their communities, the more unified they are. All right, so again, here's a good point for us to stop. Jot down your notes on what solutions you might think would work for either gender inequality or polarization. And I'm going to move on to the last section, which is customized search. It's probably the one challenge that is fueled the most by an algorithm. So how can anything that's customized be a problem? I agree. This is a bit weird for me to say that. But when you are asking for customization, you're paying a price. And the price that you're paying is that you're decreasing your awareness of what's happening in the world around you. So let's go through two search protocols, standard search protocols and customized search protocols. Standard search protocol is what we were accustomed to prior to social media. In other words, you and I make a query. It's an identical query, done on the same date, in the same time period, and with the same case sensitivity, and we get a set of results. Those results are the same results in the same hierarchy. So the only thing that influences the results is our query. We are now in an era of customized search. All social media engines use customized search protocol. What does that mean? We put in our query, it's an identical query done at the same time period. We get a set of results, but those results are not shown to us because those results go through multiple filters that are run by algorithms to produce a unique set of results for you and for me. Then that unique set of results undergoes transformation. Things are reordered so that finally the result that you see and the result that I see based on an identical query is not the same. It's not the same results and it's not in the same order. So we are starting out, you and I, on a different set of facts because we're presented different results in a different order, even though our query is identical. So let's go deeper into this. What is happening between the initial generation of search results, which is identical for you and I, and the final set of search results, which is completely different for you and I, even though the query is identical? It's going through these algorithms, which is I've represented as a microchip here. So what are those algorithms doing? They're looking at the people we follow. They're looking at what you and I have retweeted, liked, and replied to in the past. Remember, all four of these things are voluntary actions. We have to do something in order for this to be registered and then captured by the algorithm and then used to categorize us. So in other words, our past actions are determining what search results we get for a particular query. That's why you and I are getting different search results even though the query is completely identical. That can't be good. That has to be bad because that means we're starting out on a different foundation. We have no commonality in our scientific discourse because the foundation is different to begin with. Let me show you a real world example. I'll show you two actually. These are two real world examples. The first is SGLT2 DAPA-CKD. That is what I searched using two accounts. Both accounts are owned by me. I did the search on the same day, at the same time, in the same location, using the same device actually. And what happened? I got top 3 results here for account number 1, which are different than the top 3 results here for account number 2. These two tweets are the same, but otherwise everything else is different. And if I expanded this out to top 5, top 10, top 20, on and on and on, the results are more likely different than they are the same. And they're ordered in a different way when those results are the same, right? So for example, here, this is number 2. This tweet here is number 1. The order is completely different for identical tweets if you go down the line, top 10, top 15, etc. I did it again. This time I did Finero. Same 2 accounts. Both of them are owned by me. The results are different, and they're ordered in a different way. These are the only 2 tweets that are the same. Everything else is different. And if you go down the line, top 10, top 15, the story is the same. So we've got a challenge here. How do we negate the effects, how do we negate the effects of the algorithm so that the only thing that influences the search results and the search hierarchy is the query and not us, not anything that we've done. All right, so this is a good stopping point right now. We're going to now go on to some solutions, okay? Again, send me your solutions through the chat or send them to me via direct messaging. Here are some of the solutions that I think might work to go from gender inequality to gender equality. So first, let's review what the challenge is. We want to increase representation. Remember, 1% per year is tepid. It's an underperformance. It's not impressive at all because Twitter does not have the kind of barriers that we see in the real world. Inclusion, we're in a good place right now, but the last time we were in a good place, bad things happened for 6 years. The voice of female scientists was really diminished compared to male scientists. We don't want that pattern to happen again. And we want to accelerate belonging. At best, we get 10% of male scientists who want to hear from female scientists, 9% if a female scientist wants to hear from a female scientist. We need those numbers to be much larger. So number 1, we've got to identify ourselves. Anywhere between 15 and 28% of the accounts that we analyzed from 2015 to 2019 in the KidneyWk meetings were unidentified. That just won't help at all. So please identify whether you're a man or a woman or whatever gender you identify with. Second, once you're identified, it behooves all of us to create a Twitter Rolodex. That's also known as a Twitter list. And what I mean to say is group scientists based on their disease expertise and not based on their gender. The reason is because when you use that, the reason is I want you to use that list, right? I want you to tweet with intent. That's the third part here. When you make that Rolodex and you share it with other people, you make it publicly available, you're going to have people who use that Rolodex or that list and people who contribute to that list, to that Rolodex. Why? Because you want to do number 3, which is you want to tweet with intent, right? If you're tweeting, reach out to people who have an expertise in that area because you're indicating to them you want to hear what they have to say about the topic. This is how interactions will be more fruitful and more educational. Don't tweet into the cyber abyss and hope that somebody responds to you because you have no idea who's going to respond, what their expertise level is, or even if they're going to respond at all. So these are 3 solutions I think might help in reaching gender equality faster on Twitter than what we're doing right now. Next, going from polarization to unification. This one is a bit harder. The first thing I want to look at is what does the ERA and the NKF do? Because if you remember, the more people they have in their communities, the less polarized they are and the more unified they are. So one of the first things that they're doing is that they have social media teams, ambassadorship. The noun is always different, but the idea is the same. They have a group of individuals tasked with highlighting key topics, moving conversations forward, engaging with other participants. I think this idea of having a social media team is actually working to the benefit of the ERA and the NKF. They're able to unify their networks more than polarize them. Second, avoid vanity metrics. These are vanity metrics. I know algorithms love these metrics, but human beings should not love these metrics. They do not measure the health of our community. In fact, they're easily inflatable. And I have done this myself, actually, by coding some scripts. They don't measure the health of your community. They just make you feel good. They put you back in the honeymoon period. And as nephrologists and Twitterati, which is a phrase to describe us, we're not in the honeymoon period anymore. We're in a leadership position. We need to avoid vanity metrics. They don't help us. Third, borrow an idea from the oncology world. And I've listed the citations up here. What's interesting about Onc Twitter is that they've created disease-specific hashtags. Hashtags related to particular types of malignancies, particular type of hematologic disorders, and they've standardized those hashtags across the Onc Twitter community. At least they're trying to do so. Why is that important for nephrology? Because let's face it, we're all going to be part of a polarized group within the social media network. And unless you're like me and you can do high order analyses and identify where you are in the group, you're not going to know where you are and you're not going to know how to get out of it. So the only way to get out of your polarized group is to know that there are standard hashtags for particular disease processes. And if you're not seeing information about those disease processes, it means you're in a polarized group. To get out of that group, you use that hashtag for a particular disease process and jump into a new group. So for example, I showed you a picture where there was a polarized group of individuals and they were not getting information about diabetic kidney disease. Their majority illusion is that nobody's talking about diabetic kidney disease. It's not a hot topic. There's nothing new and exciting. That's why I'm not seeing anything. Well, if you had a standardized hashtag for diabetic kidney disease, for example, hashtag diabetic kidney disease, and you're not seeing any information about it, the presence of that hashtag will allow you to get out of your polarized group and into another group, where you can then see if there's information that you need to know about regarding diabetic kidney disease. So the oncology community does this really well, and this is a community effort. You can't have these hashtags just made by individuals. All of the societies who are making tremendous investments into Twitter learning, which you know they are because I showed you a graph early in the presentation about how many conferences are online and that there are societies behind those conferences who are making the effort to be on Twitter. All of these societies should try to come together and make a standardized set of hashtags, disease specific, so that we can break out of our polarized group if we happen to be in it. And lastly, how do we generate search results that are based on query and uninfluenced by our previous actions? So this is a purely algorithmic driven challenge. Even though we are retweeting and we are liking and we are feeding the algorithm, it's unlikely that we're going to stop replying, stop retweeting, stop following people. So we're always going to feed the algorithm. So we've got to negate the algorithm's effect. The problem is we don't have access to the back end of anything, so we can't change what the algorithm does. So the only thing we can do is create a new search engine that will ignore our past behavior and focus solely on the query. And that's what I did here with nephtwitterarchive.com. So if you remember in my disclosure slide, I told you I'm going to talk about this search engine at the end. And so we're coming to the end, so here we go. So I created a search engine that uses standard search protocol. It's completely agnostic to any of your online behavior. It translates all of the tweets into English up front. You don't have to make that effort whatsoever. And it finds tweets with high information density because, let's face it, complex nephrology topics are difficult to convey in 280 characters. Not 280 words, 280 characters. So if you have a tweet that has high information density with a citation or with multiple pictures or a short video, that's going to be more educational than just text alone. And it indexes all of the tweets from Twitter, from all those conferences that I showed you early on, from 2011 to the present day. Finally, there's no cost. You don't have to pay. There's no sponsor for this. There are no advertisements. I've done this completely free because that's how passionately I feel that we need standardized search and not customized search. Here's some data that you can see how many people are actually making successful searches. And I'm going to show you how this works so that you understand how to use it. It's pretty straightforward, but I'll show it to you anyway. So here's nephtwitterarchive.com, and you get two options of what you want to put in. So I'm going to put in SGLT2, and then I'm going to put in DAPA CKD, hit enter, and I'm going to let this search engine do its magic. So it will go into Twitter and find things about SGLT2 inhibitors, and it updates every 15 minutes. Here you see the year that the tweet was written, the author that wrote it, the text of the tweet. Sometimes the text is a bit garbled because there are specific emojis that are not recognized yet by the search engine, but for the most part, you'll get the gist. It's all in English, so even if a tweet is in a different language like French or Spanish, you're going to see the English version. And then here's the link. You can just click on this link. It'll take you to the primary tweet. We can do the same thing again for finerenone. If you remember, I use that as an example as well. So just erase what you have here. Type in finerenone and see what you get. Everything is done by lowercase because this accommodates a variety of different languages. So we've just made everything simple. Just use lowercase on everything. And again, you'll get your tweets right here. So hopefully this will be helpful for you in finding standard search results so that people are on the same foundation moving forward when they're going to have a conversation about something. So we're at the end. In conclusion, we have challenges. We're not the only society that has challenges when it comes to Twitter-based education. Every society does, but because we're up at the front, we see those challenges a lot more clearly than other societies do. If we have a closed-minded approach, ignore these challenges, trivialize them, minimize them, which we can do, and some of us are really good at doing that, we're not going to end up in a blissful place. We're going to end up with a community that's much worse than we ever intended it to be. So how do we do all this? It's not simple, but at least we have a roadmap. Here are my suggestions. Let's stop discriminating once and for all. This is a component that we imported from our real-world communities into our Twitter community. We should never have imported it to begin with, but now that it's there, we have to make an active effort to extract gender inequality from our Twitter communities. Number two, don't feed the algorithms. So contribute original content. Try not to retweet if you can. Package something else in your own words and add some additional perspective or scientific data to your tweet. The algorithms are always going to be there. They're never going to go away, but if you're going to be categorized by an algorithm, at least let the algorithm categorize you correctly in your own words and through your own voluntary actions rather than through somebody else's words. Finally, we've got to separate fake news from facts. We don't have as much of a fake news problem as the broader society does. I think our abilities to scrutinize data and to demand empiric data before we make a decision protects us. But what we do have are algorithms and searches that do not allow us to have a common foundation. So we're operating on a different set of facts if we're operating on facts at all. And that makes our scientific discourse difficult with each other. And it puts us at odds with each other because we're not even starting out at the same foundation. So we've got to change that. And that's it. So I want to thank you for your attention. I really appreciate your time. And if you have any questions, send me a DM, use the chat box, and hopefully I'll see you online and at a conference real soon. Thanks.